All right, whenever you're ready.
A few weeks ago, my wife and I took a trip to the Huntington Library, and we were impressed with the display that we saw there. It was the Gutenberg Bible, and it was a huge display. And in looking at it, we realized that this was the very first major book that was produced using the printing press, the modern printing press. And so we thought, well, that's pretty important, that those who developed the printing press decided that the first major book would be the Bible. Now, also, it's well known that there's been more copies of the Bible that have been printed than any other book. Thinking about my own experience, I've been reading through the Bible for the last 5 years, every year, all the way through. And I found that for myself, that my personal faith has increased about 5 times from reading it through over and over again. And so when I think about all of this together, if we were going to think about spiritual questions and spiritual issues, I think we need to start with the Bible. Now, talking about spiritual questions is what my talk is all about. And let me explain. I find that it's easy to talk about the weather. It's not too hard to talk about your hobbies and your interests. And I even can talk about politics, and that I can do that. But when it comes to talking about spiritual questions, it's really hard. Because I find that I'm worried that I'm going to hurt people's feelings, or I'm going to get in an argument. And so I try to just stay away from it. And I think that's most of our experiences. We stay away from questions that have to do with spiritual questions and differences. But when you think about it, it's really too bad, because often what's at our hearts and what's most important to us are spiritual things. So it's a shame we can't really talk about this. And so I've been thinking about it. Is there any way that we can bridge this gap? Any way that we can start talking about what we believe without being afraid? And so I have come up with a plan that I'm going to be sharing today. It's a 4-point plan, and it's going to be helpful for everyone, but I think particularly for 2 relationships where it's most critical, and that's going to be marriages, and also for teenagers and parents. So I'll be talking about that. Now, the first point in my plan has to do with friendship. Now, I like to play tennis, and 3 times a week I go out and I play tennis, and we play doubles. And it turns out in my area, most of my tennis buddies are Vietnamese. And we get to talking. They love to share. And we go to Starbucks and we talk. And they will say why they came from Vietnam. What was their experience in the United States? And I can recall one incident where I talked to one person and he says, I just can't understand what's happening in world events and some of the terrible things we see in the news. And for me personally, I have a Buddhist belief, and we believe you should love your neighbor. And I said, well, that's what I believe too. I have a Christian belief, and we believe that too. So I learned something, that he and I, both from different perspectives, believe you should love your neighbor. Another example I found is at home with my mother-in-law. Now it turns out I lived with my mother-in-law, with my wife, for 2 years. She actually close to 3. She has been living with us. And it turns out I remember when I was 10 that I used to love to have my mother read stories to me. And it helped us to really have a bond from reading those stories. And I thought, well, what if I do that with my mother-in-law? So I started reading stories to her. And it's really been great because she just loves it. She can't read herself. So every day we read a story. And we've read virtually all of Jules Verne's books. We've read the Oz books. We've read many classics. We just recently read David Copperfield. And it's been so neat to have that experience, and we both enjoy it. And now she's my friend. And like when I forget to turn off the lights, she'll say, Dave, you forgot to turn off the lights. Just to do that for me. So we're friends. Even though some people say you can't get along with your mother-in-law, not with me. But friendship, I found, is so important and develops communication. Now, when you think about it, when you read the Bible, which is part of my plan, is to read the Bible together, Jesus really valued friendship. And there was a story. It was about Jesus and a Samaritan woman. In that story, he asked for water, and she gave him some water. And they got to talking, and they talked about differences between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people, where they would worship. And they also talked about her marriage and what her experience was in marriage. And then they got to his good news. But it wasn't until they were friends and they were talking about these things that they were able to get to this deeper issue. So here we see it in the Bible also, how friendship paves the way to deeper communication. Now, there is another way that is important, and this is finding commonalities. And I found this out through my son. Now I have one of my sons loves baseball, and we found that throughout his life that he loved baseball, that we wanted to get to know him better after he graduated from college. We wanted to have a closer relationship. And so we suggested, well, why don't you pick out a vacation? And so he picked Japan. And we went to Japan, and one of the places he decided to pick was a Japanese baseball game. Well, this turned out to be a great experience for us because we had this common experience that we could talk about and share. And it paved the way to being able to talk more and to understand each other more. Now, it turns out that as you read the Bible, you can also find commonalities, which is what I'm going to suggest. When you actually study it, you find that in the Bible there are things that are taught that are true for almost every religion. And one is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, this is what Jesus taught, but it's taught in almost every other faith. For example, the Buddhist faith, the way they will say it is, treat not others in ways that yourself would find hurtful. If we talk about the Islam or the Muslim faith, which is in the news recently, in their writings they say, not one of you truly believes until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. Isn't this the golden rule? If you look at the Hindu faith, this is the sum of all duty. Do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you. And so, if we read the Bible, we should look for commonalities. If we're doing it as a joint Bible study, and we're looking at it together with people of different backgrounds and beliefs, and we will find things that we can talk about that we have in common. Now, that isn't to say that there won't be differences, and there will be. There'll be important differences. But we should be able to talk about these things, because we have things that are important that we want to understand, and we can learn from each other. And so I've found that one of the important ways to do that is through sharing. If we share our experience, nobody's going to get mad and get angry if we're talking about our experience. And that is a great way, I think, to talk about these differences. Now let me give an example. I took a flight to North Carolina a few weeks ago. Oh, excuse me. Yes.
Oh, that's what the flight was.
I took a flight to North Carolina a few weeks ago, and I was sitting next to a gentleman, and we got to talking, and we found we had things in common, and we built a friendship. And after a while, I found that I wanted to share an experience that I had that related to my beliefs. Now, it was about the idea of heaven and eternal life. And this is something that different faiths have different perspectives on. Some believe there isn't a heaven. some believe there is a heaven, but the way you reach it is different than the Christian faith says. So there are important differences. But I shared my perspective, and that was from an experience I had when I was about 10 years old. Now I can remember I was in bed, and it was a stormy night, and I could hear thunder and lightning. And I thought, oh boy, what if lightning hits the roof tonight? And what if I die tonight? That would be terrible. I mean, my life would be over. Boy, and I was really nervous about that. But then, after I learned more about my faith, which teaches that you can know that you can have an everlasting life, and we can be confident in that, it was really a relief to me to feel like I can know that where I'm going to happen after I die. And so, the person I talked to did not get angry. Because this is my experience. This is why I learned this was so important to me. And even though he had a different perspective, he could appreciate where I was coming from and that this was important to me. Now, the fourth part of my plan is a resource that I think will help us to be able to study the Bible together. And if you look at the screen that I have up here of this book, which I wrote to help people to read through the Bible and appreciate it like I have. It says, unlock the meanings from the whole Bible. Now that gives you a clue to what this book is about. It's not a lecture type of a book, it's a discovery type of a book. And so it has places for you to journal and write what you're learning. It also has thoughts from other people just to compare with what you're thinking that this says. It has themes, what are thought to be themes, and what I think are central meanings, but just from what I'm putting as my perspective. And it also has photos from Israel. So these are kind of, I think, a unique way to make a discovery as you read through the Bible, and as a basis of discussion, which you can do with people of different beliefs. Now, one example of a photo is of the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, if you're familiar with this was where Jesus spent his last night before he was crucified. It's a very dramatic time in the life of Jesus. And so, by looking at this, and this came from a trip to Israel my wife and I took in 2009, that you can actually see the area where he was on that last night, and you could talk about it. What must it have been like with Jesus, knowing that the next day he was going to be crucified? And so this is one example of the many photos I have that can be discussed in reading through the Bible. Now, when we think about this, all in all, I'd like to make a little summary. Now, what I'm suggesting is an interfaith Bible study. This would be studied by people of different faiths. It's going to be where you're going to look for friendship. You're going to also look for commonality, see what you have in common. And you're going to use this book, A Path Through the Bible, as a resource to jointly read and to share as you go through it together. Now, there are two relationships that I think are particularly would benefit by doing this together. And the first is marriages. Now, my experience from being married for 40 years, but having gone through the dating situation, I remember that I wanted to make myself look good, and my wife did too. And we tended to emphasize the positive. And if there was anything kind of negative, we kind of hoped we just said it as little as possible because we wanted to make an impression. Well, that's the kind of the way what can happen with faith. If your faith is somewhat different than your spouse's, it's something that you may not have talked too much about because you don't want to get hurt feelings just because of that, what happens. But then when you get married, it's going to be a different story because you have to look at your differences. You have to decide, well, are we going to each go to the same church? Are we going to go to different churches? We have different backgrounds. How are you going to raise the kids? Are they going to be your belief or my belief? So there's questions that we're going to come up. And so if we have that situation where we have different backgrounds, one could be a Jew, one could be a Christian, or even in the Christian faith, one could be a Catholic, one could be a Protestant. If we talk about those things, and we could use my resource and to see what do we have in common, what do we have that's different, and how could we come to some joint conclusions, I think it's a way that can then help marriages to be stronger. Now, the second major relationship I want to suggest is for teenagers and for their parents. Now, having taught high school as well as college, I recognize that teenagers want to be different. They want to be their own persons, which in many ways is healthy. And so sometimes they will rebel just to be different. Now, that's healthy to want to be different, but it's a problem if you're rebelling just to be different. Because then you're not really thinking about what are you going towards, other than being different than your parents. So I think this would be a great plan for parents and teenagers to talk about what they believe, and in a very respectful way. Like the teenagers, they can say, well, I like this, and I experienced this, and the parents could say this. And then the teenagers, they can pick what they think from having really thought about it and having talked about it. And I think they would feel good about themselves because they've done it on their own. So, altogether, I think using this four-point plan, it can be helpful for everyone who wants to, in communicating with others of different beliefs, but it also particularly for these two key relationships that I'm suggesting. And it really, at heart of this is the concept of kindness and understanding. We're trying to be kind to each other and understanding each other, and we're communicating. I want to thank a group that's been kind to me. They're the Toastmasters Club, the Achievers 9331, who have given me much input on this. And I would like to conclude with a quote by a famous person, Mark Twain. And he said, "Kindness is the language which the deaf can hear and the blind can see."